And I'd now like to open this up to questions and answers. As Sandra said at the beginning, I have received some written questions because not everybody can be here today. So we asked colleagues who couldn't to submit written questions in advance. But obviously, I'm hoping that we will have some questions from the floor as well.
Sophie, just if I may, I noticed in the questions that had been submitted in advance, I haven't seen all because more came in this morning, which I haven't read yet, but several of the questions had to do with issues that are squarely in the management and reform portfolio, Greg Vine's portfolio and departments, on questions on IT, questions on IRIS, et cetera. I would really prefer not to take those questions because it's not my direct responsibility. And although we discuss everything in the senior management team, that's the notion, is that I have to be aware of what's going on in management administration in order to do what I do, and Gilbert has to know what I'm doing, to, et cetera. So while we discuss these things, we discuss them at the sort of, decision-making final summary point, and I don't know all the details, and so I would rather not take those questions, because if I do, I will give you an answer which is not fully informed, and that won't be particularly helpful. So I would rather take questions on either the broad direction of the organization, how the policy headquarters reform fits with the field reform. Happy to talk to you about that. Global technical teams, anything along those lines. Happy to talk about that, but not the management things. And then if there are structural questions to deal with the field reform, who's going to go to which unit, or is an office going to move? I mean, that really is Gilbert and the regional director's priority. And quite frankly, I don't know that the answers are there yet, even with that. Even if they were sitting here, they may not be able to give you the final answers. And I certainly can't give you those answers. So rather than fumble around and waste time when I don't have an answer for you, I would prefer not to take either of those types of questions, just because it's not what I'm responsible for. Anything I'm responsible for, I'm happy to answer, even if it's a sensitive question.
Super. Karen has a question.
Thank you very much. My name is Karin Klotzbücher. I'm in charge of the regional programming services here in the region. My question relates to something that's also still quite new. You've just referred to it, the global technical teams. And in particular, I'd like to know a little bit what the current thinking is regarding the role of these teams in the Decent Work Country program developments. Implementation is perhaps another issue, but at this point I'd like to know, what the thoughts are regarding the involvement of those teams in, for example, the quality assurance mechanism that we have for the Decent Work Country programs. And as you probably recall, in the early days, the technical departments in Geneva were very much part of that process, in addition to program and the gender bureau and all these units. That changed over the years, and the technical departments took less of a role in that at their own request. And I'm just wondering now whether you see a particular role for these global teams in that, and how would that look? What would that look like in practical terms? Because these teams are global, not sitting in one location, have to communicate through various means, and so on and so forth.
So the global technical teams, well, first of all, something like the global technical teams has existed on paper for a while. Apparently there's an IGDS. I have not set myself the goal of reading all IGDSs. I may be I may be punished for saying that, but there are just too many, and I mean there are too many. We've got to streamline. We've got to have very, very clear rules where people know where to go and which one will answer the question. Not that there's 27 and you have to know why the one this year referred to something that you hadn't read yet. But in theory, technical experts in regional, DWT, and country offices were part of a team that was led by the departmental director for their technical expertise, and they were to have some kind of a community that would function. In theory, this was on paper, it was supposed to happen. It actually did happen in some areas. My understanding, at least from what our people tell me in the enterprise department, is that the enterprise department and the enterprise specialists in the field actually have functioned as something like a team, not not quite at the level of organization that we have in mind going forward, which I'll talk to you about in a moment, but that the meetings have been fairly regular, at least once a year, maybe more than once a year, and other coordination mechanisms. And so something like a proto-global technical team has operated in some areas, and enterprises was pointed out to me as one example of a relatively advanced. And then on a sliding scale from that to nothing, where there has been no global technical team in any form. And in most departments, what are now the departments, somewhere in between. So social protection has been meeting with all the field specialists on social protection. I know because I was at the meeting in 13, there was a meeting in 13. I know that Isabel Ortiz had a meeting going on while I was at the G20 summit. So I know at least for the last 2 years there have been at least annual meetings. How closely knit that team is, I can't say, and it's one that certainly will be moved up, and the others are in various stages there. What we intend now is that this becomes something not on paper or in theory, but in practice, at least for every department that we have in headquarters. And I'll come back to the at least, because in a few departments, really it would make up multiple global technical teams. I'm thinking of work quality now, where we have wage specialists and we have people working on migration and we have people working on gender. And so a work quality technical team may not be the logical way to organize that. But in most cases, what we have in mind is that there will be global technical teams in which not a subgroup, but all specialists in the field, all specialists on regular budget, and all specialists on extra budgetary contracts. All of those specialists who work on an area will be part of the global technical team. Let me just use the example of employment policy. Azita Barar, the head of that department, will be responsible for laying out the plan for that global technical team, the structure for making the plan, and then convening meetings which will occur face-to-face at least once a year, and by other means throughout the year, which can be teleconference, video conference, working on shared electronic platforms, whatever. There could be such meetings of subgroups of employment policy because, as you know, that's a huge field and there are many different aspects to employment policy, youth employment and infrastructure development, et cetera. But the goal is that, again, setting aside work quality and possibly governance, because those are multifaceted departments, but the director will head the team. All of the specialists with that expertise will be part of that team. The meetings will happen with a frequency that I just detailed. And they will all begin not later than the first quarter of 15. In most cases, the plan is for a meeting in January or February. I mean, this is going to happen. It's going to happen now. We're not waiting. We had, just before the DG and I left for the G20, we had a global management team meeting with the regional directors, and I distributed to them basically a first take on how we see the global technical teams operating, which both gave a little background where they have been meeting, at what stage have they advanced to, and what more do they need to do where they haven't, how will they be launched, and a timetable. When will be the face-to-face meeting, and what frequency of other kinds of interactions do they envision? So there is a plan on paper, subject to consultation. I don't know now, I left and I have not had a chance to follow up, but our hope was, and I'll speak with Yoshi tomorrow, but Thaddeus, you can take this on. The hope was that this would be considered by the regional directors for their initial views, but then disseminated broadly to you, for you to look at, so we can get feedback before we finalize the plan for the global technical teams, and perhaps even terms of reference or even an IGS, although I don't want to add to the pile, to get your feedback about what in your area of expertise sounds right. Is this about the right frequency? Is this the right team, et cetera? Or anything that you want to suggest that we think about. So that's out there. I mean, it's been floating around for, well, at least with regional directors for, I guess, a week or so, but it needs to get out. We need to get your feedback, and then we'll finalize. So this is happening. Where we still have some thinking to do, and your thinking will be extremely welcome on this, is for the departments where we very consciously decided to bring together multiple facets of related questions, like work quality. So work quality deals with wages, hours, and working conditions across the board. And then for groups that need extra attention, like gender, migrant, et cetera, so HIV positive. So it brings together sort of all the departments that you could say were working on wages, hours, and working conditions across the board or for groups. And we put them together because this was an example par excellence of where we had people working in tiny little units and they couldn't take on the big questions because they were too small. And so we put them all together. And I can tell you, with probably a handful only of exceptions, the people who are now in that work quality department and headquarters say this was absolutely the right thing to do. We are invigorated by this. We're working across lines. So you know, wages and gender. We're looking much more at the cross fertilization. You know, and migrants and out. We're bringing it together in a way which is very productive for the ILO. It was the right move to make. But then when you think about the global technical team, well, if it was a work quality technical team, it would be not everybody, but almost everybody who's a specialist of anything, because they all relate to that. So we still have not, we will do it, and we will do it in the first quarter of 15. We've made that absolute commitment, but we're still figuring out, is this one team with subgroups, or is this actually a couple of teams, or should we sort of, I don't want to say fuse, but abut the governance technical team and the work quality where it makes sense, because the governance department has social dialogue in it. The work quality department has collective bargaining in it. Well, a lot of the specialists on those issues obviously would be having to go to additional global tech. Is there a way that we can have them be separate but make the meetings contiguous? And actually, some of the planning going on for this first round of meetings in the first quarter of 15 is exactly to see if we could possibly arrange that. So that's one possibility, but I have to say it's a work in progress. We don't have a final answer. Same for governance, because it's, you know, it's labor law reform, it's labor inspection, it's social dialogue, et cetera. So those are a bit more complex. Now, to get to the second part of your question, so that's how they're operating, where we stand on this. What will be their role in the decent work country programs? You know, the purpose of the global technical teams is not so much a coordination function. So, for example, the ACIs, that's a coordination function. We have an ACI task team, which is getting together to say, all of the pieces come together here. We have a video conference and we decide what the plan is for a biennium, and we then check on where we are. We make tweaks to it. That coordination function properly belongs in the ACI. It doesn't belong in the departmental, because the department may be feeding several ACIs, and that's not the place where it all comes together. The global technical teams, in our view, is basically a combination of peer learning across the teams, staff development. We see this very much as bringing things that you will find enriching in your career, the latest thinking on an issue, the latest debates on a particular issue in your field, bringing experts when you have your face-to-face meetings to bring it. We really see it much more as a raising the level of the team kind of an endeavor, and most of the effort that will go into it will be in that light. So now you have your enterprise specialists, so you have your employment policy specialists, and the idea will be in that team, we take stock of what we have, what we know, and what we don't know, and where is the edge that we have to push, where is the frontier that we have to push, and finding ways to do that. There will necessarily be a coordination function as well. Aside from the ACIs, you get demanded all the time by constituents. They want you to come and do something. And those GTTs, global technical teams, can also be a coordination function of, I can't possibly do it because, you know, I've got 17 things on my to-do list for that week. And I also don't have the skills, or I have the skills, but I have 17 things. The global technical teams, I would see as kind of an upstream input to your work on decent work country programs. They will not have any direct responsibility in terms of the development of the decent work country programs, because if you think about it, they couldn't. I mean, it's a process of iteration with the constituents in the country, and therefore to say that it could in any way be driven by or put into a work plan by the global technical team just doesn't make sense. So in that certain sense, it's not a direct input. It is an upstream input, because to the extent that it's increasing your ability and capacity personally, but also your knowledge of who to reach for particular knowledge, it's an input to what we can promise to do in a decent work country program. And so it's an upstream input, but there is not a direct relationship. Where there is a direct relationship in terms of the reorganization, and this now was decided by the DG and the SMT, and where the policy portfolio and the headquarters and you come directly together with respect to decent work country programs, is that we are about to, I guess I would say, test and pilot a new approach to an initial diagnostic that would inform your work on new forthcoming or revised decent work country programs. So what do I mean by that? Well, I mean, you have the process of how you develop these, and you know a lot more about it because I have never developed an ILO decent work country program. That's not been one of my responsibilities for the ILO, although I've certainly developed country programs with other governments. But you develop that through a process, again, of discussion, consultation, even negotiation, and you come out with the priorities that are agreed, what the ILO will do with that country for the 3 or 4 or 5 year horizon. Some of those decent work country programs were informed by various diagnostic studies, actually by quite a few different diagnostic studies, which have acronyms. I won't remember all of them. So we had decent work country profiles. We had something that came out of the 2009 jobs program. There was a series of, so there were I think at least 3, possibly 4 different streams, typically funded by donors, to look at a limited number of countries with a particular methodology to do a diagnostic of what, within our area of responsibility, let's just call it decent work, what needed to be done in that country. Where were the problems? Where was the progress? What could be done? And those were meant to be either ex ante inputs to decent work country programs. In other words, you would have that in front of you when you went to talk to the countries, and in some cases that happened and they were quite useful. Or ex post, looking back, were we on the right issues? I mean, were these the things that moved the needle, that made a change in the country? But these were different streams funded by donors, each one with a collection of countries, sometimes 2 or 3 countries, sometimes up to 8 or 9 countries, different methodologies. You know, quite frankly, it was chaotic. It was not a systematic way of saying, how do we inform, what are the binding constraints, what are the critical areas for attention that ought to be addressed in a decent work country program? And they were very ad hoc, in the sense that if you had a stream of work and a donor wanted to fund it and they agreed on that country, then you had one, and if not, you didn't have one. So it was not a way for us to serve our constituents well. So what we have proposed and what is being tested, we meaning the policy portfolio, have proposed, and SMT has agreed to explore it through a pilot, is an approach which will be an across-the-board, fairly basic diagnostic tool where you would evaluate all the main elements of what comprises decent work for a country using a pretty standardized methodology, using a lot of data, either that we know we can provide you from our databases in Geneva, or that we think you can get in most countries. And we will consolidate this into a process, a description, a guidebook, a manual of how to do it, and we will train X number of specialists from the regions each year in Turin to be able to do this. So we want that capacity not to be a TC, donor-funded, occasional for some country process. We want it to be streamlined enough that any smart expert can be trained to do it, that you don't have to be a statistician or you don't have to be a social protection specialist. You can be trained to do it. And gradually build the capacity in every region to have enough people who can do that for every country where you are about to go into a process of developing a decent work country program or a renewed version of one, that you can do the diagnostic in the region with skilled capacity that you have. We're pretty far along. I mean, we've been proposing this for a while now. The decision finally from the DG was well, let's do this, get all the materials ready, and let's pilot it in a couple of cases and see how it goes, and then we'll decide if that will be our standard diagnostic approach. Jose Manuel Salazar Ziranox, who some of you may know, my deputy, is leading the work on this. Peronis, whom some of you may know, did some of the early developmental work, then left, and apparently we may be lucky enough to get him back to help with the materials, the training materials. We'll be working with ITC, obviously, Patricia O'Donovan and her team, to develop the training. But the notion is that we really want to decentralize the diagnostic capacity by embedding, again, we'll do the training so that in the first round, somebody from at least somebody from every region, but hopefully more than one from every region will get the first round of training, and then the next year we will do more, so that gradually you have quite a cadre of people who are capable of going through this standardized diagnostic, which, like I say, it's going to be very streamlined, but it's not basic. I mean, it really goes to the heart of our questions in smart ways, but it's very streamlined, and it's something that people can be trained to do. We're very confident of that. So that will be something of the new organizational structure, the interface between headquarters and the field, that will be coming to you with a very direct relevance to and impact upon the development of decent work country programs.
Thank you very much for that. Do we have any other questions from the floor? Okay, well, in that case, let me put a couple of questions from colleagues who unfortunately can't be here today. One of these, which I think is rather pertinent to this audience, is most of the countries in this region are now middle-income countries, and the UN generally is still struggling to reposition itself within these category of countries. What do you see as the ILO's role in middle-income countries? And perhaps I can give a little bit of common background, which is I have another question which makes the point that the ILO, from a field perspective, is seen as very centralised and HQ-driven and following a policy agenda that is primarily, as it's put here, OECD-centric. So that is the background against which this question is coming. And how can we make both our policy agenda and our organisational structure more responsive to this category of countries?
Fine. Well, in terms of OECD-centric, when I came to the ILO, which was, as I say, now going on 3 years ago, from an advanced economy government, but one that was working with countries at all income levels, low, lower middle, and peer advanced economies. I felt that the ILO put too much attention to advanced economies. I felt that there were there is plenty of good work to do there. The normative framework of the ILO has to be available to applied in Norway, just like it does in Nepal. It's not that we shouldn't be serving all of our members, but I felt that the weight of attention, particularly given the scattering of resources that existed at the time, was a bit too oriented toward advanced economies in general, and quite frankly, Europe in particular. We have shifted that in a very, very big way. I can tell you that part of the reorganization was to make sure that we didn't do anything structural or in terms of leadership that would tend to reinforce a European orientation. Again, not because Europe once again needs our help a lot. Spain needs our help, Greece needs our help, Portugal needs our help, and the rest of Europe needs our help. But the rest of the world needs our help even disproportionately, even more. And so we have to be very aware of that. So in terms of the resources we're putting in terms of the way that we think about our work plans, in terms of the way we have oriented the ACIs and the countries that we're focusing on as pilots in them, one could no longer say that there was an overemphasis on OECD or advanced economies or on Europe. Some individual staff members are more interested in what goes on in advanced economies. Only a very few questions that we addressed are more pertinent to advanced economies. That's legitimate. We have 187 member states in very different situations, and we have obligations to all of them. But the shift to much more attention away from OECD, I think, is marked. And if there's a perception of that, it's a perception based on the past. It's not what you would have seen coming out of our reports this year. if you looked at the World Social Protection Report, you would not have seen a distortion in the emphasis of it. You would have seen a very global perspective. We're coming out with the Global Wage Report, which is now a biennial product of the ILO. We're going to release it on, I believe, December 5th. You will see that this is not at all an OECD-centric approach. And I think you see that increasingly in the World of Work reports, which are going to be transformed and combined with the Global Employment Trend Report next year into something called the World Employment and Social Outlook. So those two so-called flagships are going to be one flagship with an update. January will be like a light update, sort of statistical projection, and then in May or June you'll get the full report. But I think you shouldn't just take my word for it. You should look at our products, and you will see that. Specifically, the World of Work report, which came out in June this year, for the first time in a while, concentrated primarily on the development process in developing countries. I highly recommend it to you if you haven't already read it. It's a very robust analysis. We engaged not only all of the appropriate staff inside the ILO, but including some in the field, but also external experts who are the top names in their field. It's a very robust analysis of how do you do development in a way that creates jobs and that is broadly inclusive and that raises incomes and livelihoods. So that, it's not a perfect report. We didn't cover everything, and we sure don't have all the answers, but it was a real contribution to the development debate, specifically from the perspective of decent work. So I think that criticism, Sophie, really goes back to the past. It's not our intention, and I think the evidence is there that we've already made that shift.
Right, and the second part of the question was, how do you see the ILO's role in middle-income countries like those that we find a lot in Asia Pacific?
Sure. Well, middle income encompasses a lot. It's everything except the very top and the very bottom, right? And so, middle income countries, that's Brazil, right, is a middle income country. Well, I guess Vietnam is a lower middle income country, and Malaysia is a middle income, and China is still, by most measures, a middle income. So, there is a lot of variety there. I think, I would say for the lower middle income countries, I don't think we have to make the case of what our relevance is, what we can offer. Their demands on us are more than we can satisfy, quite frankly. I think we can be more precise in terms of focusing our attention. We certainly can raise our games in terms of having true, effective answers with an empirical foundation for their questions. That's what we're all straggling at. That's our frontier that we're pushing. So we can get a lot better at what we offer, but I don't think that we're suffering a lack of demand. Upper middle income countries, I think, maybe Brazil thinks we don't have anything to tell them, but as a dear Brazilian colleague once told me, Brazilians don't think that anybody can tell them anything. And so I don't think it's just us. China, it's very interesting. In countries like China, in countries like Brazil, less so in India, but I think increasingly true in India as well. What we're seeing is they want to partner with us in two ways. On very specific issues, they want us to come as technical advisors to them and bring our knowledge, our analysis, and best practices to them and help them in very hands-on ways, the way we might help a lower income country on those specific issues, but assuming that they have capacity, institutional capacity to absorb what we bring, or that we can help them develop it that next increment. So yes, technical assistance, technical advice. But they are also much more wanting to be seen as our partners in being able to provide advice to other countries, particularly those who may be a income notch or a generation behind their development, where they think they have extremely relevant and pertinent experience that they want to share, and they would like the ILO to be the medium, the mechanism through which they go and deliver it. So increasingly they're asking us to help organize knowledge transfer from them to countries at a lower income or earlier development stage. And so we have a double kind of, this is absolutely true with China. Again, it's relatively less true with Brazil. They're asking for the technical advice and more asking for us to engineer the opportunities for South-South collaboration. But so it's across there. I think our biggest challenge with middle-income countries is really raising the quality of our evidence and our advice, of just having more cutting-edge advice that they haven't thought of and that they can't get from any other institution. I think that's where we have the opportunity to really push the envelope.
Great, thank you very much. I'm now going to wrap this up because it's 29 minutes past 12 and lunch is due to start at 12:30, and I think it's more than my life is worth to make you late for your lunch. So I'd like to thank Sandra very much for her time and her frankness in asking the questions, and thank you all for attending, and thank those colleagues who submitted questions, which were very impressive in both their range and their detail.